with advancements in that, that testing, like we get to now discern even more clearly, right? At today, somewhere around 65% of euploid embryos that we call normal will implant. About 35% of them that won't. And, so what's different about those 35%? And so it's super exciting to me, to continue to develop and push the needle on, discerning what are the characteristics, in those subsets that we can further, can we get that number to 80%, right? Like how many more patients can we get pregnant? How many more miscarriages can we save? How many, how much time can we save these people from, from that wait to parenthood? And it's a really exciting opportunity, for me professionally. And all I can think about is just continuing to make sure that we shorten that time and stop wasting people's time and money.
This episode is an all you need to know episode. What do I mean by that? Well, we're going to pull back the curtain on all the things that happen behind the scenes in the fertility lab so you understand how the doctors, the embryologists, the entire staff are thinking about your cycle. You're going to understand about genetics. You're going to understand about the technologies that are coming down the path. You're going to understand about embryo safety and so much more. These are really important things to know, and most patients don't know these things. And I'm going to introduce you to somebody who's going to give you all of this information in a step-by-step manner so you can understand it very well and be an advocate in your treatment. So let's get started. From our Building Your Family community, this is the Building Your Family podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Schumann, author, researcher, and reproductive medicine therapist. As the leading destination for support and education for people using reproductive medicine to grow their families, we cut through the noise to provide you with research-based information, effective and actionable strategies, and the support that you need to feel better so you can get into the driver's seat of your life and build the family of your dreams. We look forward to seeing you inside. Welcome to a new episode of the Building Your Family podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today. I want to tell you what's so great about this podcast. So there are a lot of great things about it, but one of the great things I get to do, which I absolutely love, is introduce you to people that you wouldn't otherwise know. So yes, it's true. There are a lot of interesting and accomplished people on social media, but there's also a lot of people in our fertility world who are real rock stars who you would never meet, but they touch your lives in so many ways you can't imagine. And one of those people is Cynthia Hudson. She is an amazing person. And I'll just give you a quick thumbnail sketch of few of the things she does. So she's VP of Clinical Strategy at Tomorrow Life Sciences, which we'll talk about, founding partner and CEO of Nova Genomics, founding partner at Perch Fertility, president of the New England Fertility Society, and a strategic advisor for many companies. And she's got lots of other projects on her plate. It's amazing how she does it all by herself, but she's an incredible person, and I can't wait for you to meet her. So welcome, Cynthia. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thanks for having me, Lisa. It's always very embarrassing for these things.
You're very modest.
That's all good. No, and thank you. This is a great podcast, and I do listen to it, and it's a great resource for patients. And so I really appreciate you, continuing to push the needle on, bringing this information to patients and further advancing their knowledge, because knowledge is, in some sense, knowledge is power, and it gives them that comfort. Doesn't necessarily gives them all the answers, but it's a more educated approach on their family building journey. So thank you for providing all this great content.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. I'm so happy to do it. And, as you said, it's so hard for people to know what happens behind the scenes. They meet with their doctor and they have a little conversation about what's going to happen to them. And we don't really know after that what goes on, right? Even if we have an egg retrieval, our eggs go out into space someplace. We have no idea what's happening. And so as a patient, we really don't know. I mean, we hope that our doctor is going to have the right lab and choose the right people, but we really don't know what happens. So could you give our audience a little insight about maybe what happens in the lab that patients don't know about?
Sure. I mean, that's a loaded question. Unfortunately, it is deemed a black box, and I think that's a shame because it really should be a lot more transparent. We don't have a great history of transparency in this industry, and I think, that's certainly an area that we can improve. The physicians and the laboratory team are working in concert. One can't really operate without the other. So, you can stimulate, you can treat a patient, you can get her, her pituitary suppressed, you can get her ovaries to superovulate, and we can get all these eggs, but then what does the doctor do with them, right? Like now they're sitting there, I don't know what to do with these things, right? So they hand them off to the lab. The handoff is that, that recognition of, we are in lockstep at every, point in that process. So, essentially we don't call it manufacturing, but in some sense it is manufacturing. We get eggs and we get sperm and, we make embryos and then we do things with them, right? We culture them, we test them, we grade them, we freeze them, we transfer them back to to the woman's uterus. If they don't develop, we discard them. So there's an intake and an outtake process. Again, we don't call it manufacturing, but on some level it is. We have to make sure that those patients are properly identified, right? This egg came from this human and this, sperm sample came from that human, and though they belong together, and so these samples belong together, and then that downstream embryo, where is the intended uterus? It may be a gestational carrier for that uterus. It belongs to that intended parent. There's lots of different, I like to think about that strategy of, okay, well, who are the intended parents? Who's the egg provider for this either single or double intended parent couple? Who's the sperm provider, right? And then what is the source of the uterus? Because it could be any number of combinations. And it's super important for that, back to that in lockstep. Like, this is the patient, this is their intended plan, these are the parts that we need to use, and this is where it's going out on the back end. So, without that really close coordination, it's just not going to work. So to that end, we get eggs, right? And we look at them and we count them and we decide, where they are on the meiotic maturity scale, right? So this goes back to your high school biology, right? The eggs have to undergo meiosis. And so we go through prophase, anaphase, telophase, metaphase, and the eggs do that twice. And so we get to an egg where it's at metaphase 2, and we say that it is ready to be fertilized by a sperm. Sperm undergo that gametogenesis as well. They undergo meiosis. When the egg and sperm get together, then that now sort of pre-embryo undergoes mitosis. So it now has the full complement of the genetic material from the egg and the genetic material from the sperm. There is no other instance like it ever. There is an egg-sperm combination is unique. There isn't any other way to describe it. Even for a single patient, there are 10 egg-sperm combinations, and every single one of those is unique. They have similarities, but there's never going to be an egg that is exactly the same as another egg, right? We don't have that. We don't have that similarity yet. So each one has a destined fate. Each one is going to go down that process. The embryologists then culture them and, carry them through that process. And then at the end, we say, okay, which one of these is more or less or not at all likely to, create a pregnancy for the intended parent. And that part is super important. It's still within the lab sphere, but those results are then communicated to the physician, which is communicated to the patient. But at the end of the day, it's really not magic, it's math, right? We know that IVF is the story of attrition. We know that not every single egg-sperm combination makes a baby. We know that it doesn't happen in vivo, it certainly doesn't happen in vitro. But the best tool that we have is the ability to condense time. So we can say to these humans, that this couple, and it's a male-female couple, and she ovulates normally, and she has good ovarian reserve, and her fallopian tubes are open, and she has a male partner, and he has sperm, and they're getting together at the right time. They need to do this 12 times if that woman is of less than the age of 35 in order to even get the diagnosis of infertility, right? So think about that. The potential 12 egg-sperm combinations that do not produce a baby just to be called infertile in the first place.
Wow.
So the expectation that every single one of those egg sperm combinations is going to make a baby, really shouldn't be the expectation at all.
Yes.
What we can do is get all 12 of those at the same time, right? So maybe, you're ovulating one egg a month. Maybe we get all 12 of those. We just took a year of you trying and to see if there's something in there that is viable. The answer may be yes, but the answer may be no, right? And it wouldn't necessarily be surprising if the answer was no, because we know that you've been having this failure, constant egg sperm combinations, again, presuming all the, the circumstances were right, that didn't actually work.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of story of attrition is essentially what we're looking at in the lab. Like, we're trying to figure out, like, amongst this cohort of eggs that we get, what's going to sort of make it at the end, right? Because we don't want to waste anyone's time. We do not want to do a futile transfer. We don't want to transfer an embryo back just to transfer an embryo back. And there's a school of thought in this field that, we should just transfer an embryo because that gives the patient closure. I actually don't subscribe to that. I don't think that's helpful. I think that transferring a non-developing embryo, or trying to transfer the embryo early because it may not make it, I don't think is serving the patient, at the end of the day. I don't think that giving them that potential false hope is the right way to approach that family building journey. Because now the patient is going to be on medication, they're going to be taking progesterone, they're going to be anxious, they're not moving on in their journey because they're waiting for what we may know is a pretty certain outcome, that it's going to work. So what we're trying to do, and what we're trying to do with these technologies, is to figure out what are the most likely or at all likely to implant, and then kind of divide among that cohort. Let's see which is the best one back, and, kind of hope for the best. So any tool that we can use to better sort of winnow down is advantageous, not just for the embryologist, for the doctors, but for the patient, because we just don't want to waste their time.
Yeah.
Right. There's a certain percentage of decline every month that a woman ages. There was a paper recently, I apologize, I don't know exactly. It was somewhere around 2 or 3% that there was a decline in potential outcome after a certain age every month that you wait. So if you do an embryo transfer and then you wait 10 days, or 2 weeks, and then get a negative pregnancy test, and then you have to wait for a period, you're losing months, right? The clock is ticking. You're not really serving them that well. So
yes.
Kind of a long-winded answer. But.
No, this is great. It's so helpful. I mean, I think it's so interesting because you're clearly talking about, how can we be so efficient, right? And there's lots of ways that people talk about the process, and should you have a closure cycle? Should you not? How many times should you do it? But you're pointing out something so vitally important that patients don't very often understand, right? Sometimes they'll say, well, I want to use the least invasive treatment first because I don't want to think about it that way. And so maybe I'll just, do some yoga and acupuncture. And then maybe if that doesn't work, I'll think about Clomid. And if that doesn't work. And so all these months go by before you're actually doing IVF. And I think it's, as you're saying, it's very, very difficult for people with ovaries because it's very hard for them to accept that, we accept our hair gets gray, but we can't accept that our eggs get old. And all that time flies by. So I really appreciate what you're saying. It's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, listen, we think there's a lot of what I call cause and effect, right? Because I did this, then I got pregnant, right? I ate grapefruits, for 2 weeks straight. And then and that's why I got pregnant. And people post this stuff online. And, and the patients are so desperate to find some kind of answer that, they do this. And not eating grapefruits is harmful. But, there are certain things that will say, again, going back to that, it's a completely unique egg sperm combination, right? And the previous 8 weren't working, right? But then this one worked. And is it related to the fact that you ate grapefruits? I'm a scientist. I don't, necessarily believe that, but I'm happy when patients get pregnant. Yes. I do worry about the message that it sends when we really can't define cause and effect, on this. So that's what I worry. Like, you can do yoga. I think that's great. It's healthy. It's good for you. It's good mentally. It's good physically, all of those things. Is that the reason that you got pregnant on that next month?
Probably not.
Seems unlikely, but,
Yes.
Again, I want people to have, the right mental health approach, and I want people to feel comfortable. They need to feel like they've done the diligence, right? They need to feel like they've accomplished, well, if I'm supposed to do this and I didn't do this, then it's my fault, right? I think all of this is assuaging guilt.
Yes.
Because I should be able to get pregnant. Well, I mean, frankly, we're the worst, reproductively speaking, mammalian species on the planet, right? We're
Right.
terrible. Like our fecundity is in the toilet. We're really bad at it. Lower species get pregnant all the time, right? But the humans, we're so evolved, and so it's not our fault. We like to think it's our fault, but it's not. And but people need to go through that process, and they grab onto whatever kind of gives them that gratification and satisfaction that they've done something.
Right. Well, I hope you're all listening to this, because it is so vitally important to think about it in this way. Cynthia, I think it's so great that you're talking about the efficiency of really trying to preserve time. Can you also tell us a little bit about all of these advances? So your company Tomorrow has been, groundbreaking in their advances in technology in the lab. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and what makes it so important.
Yeah, I think, as the field of infertility has evolved, we went from, doing natural cycle egg collections, and, people were doing, we were trying to time ovulation, and we were trying to get those eggs, and people were doing, egg retrievals in the middle of the night. And then we figured out how to give people drugs, and, we're now getting a few eggs, right? So we can start that, attrition process. Then we figured out that, we could freeze these embryos, right? But the maxim was always, fresh is better than frozen, right? For a really long time, that was the standard. Like, we want to do a fresh transfer, and we'll freeze, the leftovers. Well, then, we started figuring out, well, maybe a hyperstimulated, person that has an estradiol of 3,000, maybe that's not the best environment to put this really nicely formed embryo back into, right? There's nothing physiologically normal about a woman that has this really hyper elevated hormonal state. So we decided that we should freeze those embryos, all of them, and then have the patient kind of get back to normal, and then come back, and put one back into that now. Again, these things need to be in harmony, right? There's the embryo that has to be at a point in development that it is ready to implant. And then the uterus has to be at a point where it's ready to receive that implantation. Okay, so it's called the implantation window. And if you miss that window, you could have a perfectly perfect blastocyst that is, there's nothing wrong with that, but you've missed the window of implantation, you're going to do a futile transfer, right? So timing that synchronous, the uterine receptivity and the embryo development sometimes and often results in a decision to freeze all the embryos because you don't want to miss the window. And then we decided in 2012 in this country that egg freezing was no longer experimental, right? Which is a major advancement. And it allowed now all of these women that were, undergoing, treatment for chemotherapy and, had other sorts of reasons for delaying family building, it gave them that window to preserve the option to do so later. So, the evolution of the embryology lab went from, we're doing all of this stuff fresh and freezing maybe some leftovers, to fast forward, we're freezing basically everything that crosses the threshold before it ever comes back out. And it's a rapid shift in how that we store and how we manage and how many patients' tissues we store and manage and which kinds, and we're freezing sperm and we're freezing embryos and we're freezing eggs, and it's just pouring in. And most of it is not most of it. I mean, certainly the eggs, most of the eggs are pouring in, and some of them may never come out. Right? So you've become now, instead of just a treatment clinic and laboratory, you've now become a long-term biorepository. And so what are the tools and technology that you need to do and to employ to manage all of that, right? I'm an embryologist. That's my background. I did not grow up in a biorepository, and, my specimen management, sure, but only in the sort of active tissue culture sense. Right? I wasn't managing a frozen tissue biobank that has
Right.
now, 10,000 patients worth of tissue, right? That was not conceived of. And you can see that in the evolution of the fertility clinic in just its physical infrastructure, right? Here's the laboratory. Well, here's the doctor's office, and here's the waiting room. Here's all the exam rooms, and here's the clinical areas, and here's the nurse's office, and here's the laboratory, and then here's the cryo room, right? And so if you go into some of these clinics, the cryo room is, I would say, full, okay? And then now you find other sort of pop-up cryo rooms around because they need to buy another tank. And, well, where are we going to put it? Well, it doesn't matter where we're going to put it. We need it, and we'll figure out where to put it later because we're going to be having all these freezes, and we need to put it somewhere, right? So it just became this story where we just got inundated, right? And it's not that hard to keep track of a couple of hundred patients. Keeping track of several thousand becomes a completely different matter. So the beginning of Tomorrow Life Science it's a funny story because there's, these company founders and, they don't have healthcare background. And, these naturally curious humans, are having a conversation with somebody that froze her eggs, and now they're peppering her with questions, right? Well, okay, well, how many eggs do you have and where are they? Like, this is this asset that you've now invested in, right? You're investing a potential opportunity in the future to procreate. And what do you know about that investment? What do you know about that asset? And she was, as the story goes, is unable to answer certain basic questions. And these guys were like, how could you not know like certain basic information about, like, you spent all this time and money and emotional effort and just, all of these things, and you really know so little, about that. And so it's like, well, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so, yeah, that's, the story of how it was born. So, and I've lived this, right? So I've been in many clinics. I've owned, these things. And how do you manage this, right? You've got a piece of paper, and you got like your 3x5 card, and you got your Excel spreadsheet, and you plug it into your EMR. But, at the end of the day, I know what I froze, and then I walk over to the cryo room, and then I go put this in tank 4, canister 3. And then I turn around and I write down that I put it in tank 3, canister 4. Like, when am I going to figure that out, right? At what point am I going to start, having a system where I can track and trace, and I have a fully immutable audit trail where, okay, this is where the software assigned that position, and it was checked into storage, using an RFID chip so that it was hands-free. And that software system, is connected to the clinic's electronic medical record system, that nobody had to write it down. So it's a two-way interface. And so it brings that level of accountability to the clinic. And in the same, same technology sphere, take these samples. This is an example of the container, that we built, and it has an RFID chip on the bottom, and it's redundantly labeled with a linear barcode, alphanumeric, iReadable. And so now I can say, well, my clinic is filling up. Why don't I, relocate some of these to offsite storage, right? So, if you have Tomorrow technology, you can log into the system and you can say, okay, well, we did all of these 50 egg freezes last month, and, there's no plan for those patients to come back right now. So I'm going to relocate them to offsite storage. So you can say, all right, all of those patients, let's check them out using the chip. You check it out, you send it to the offsite storage, you check it into offsite storage. That new location goes back through to the EMR. And so the clinic now has, an automatic extension of their clinic and their cryo room very easily using that technology base. So it's, it's a combination of hardware, it's a combination of software, it's a combination of labware, but it's, at the end of the day, it's a tool for the clinics to better manage that inventory, because you're a treatment center, right? You're a clinic. You want your embryologists and your lab people to be focused on the eggs and sperm in the laboratory, right? Going to maintain a biorepository of your own making is not the best way to utilize your time. And, if we think about resources and them being constrained and, trying to treat all these patients, that's not the best way to utilize your time and resources, in my opinion.
Yes. That's fascinating. Well, I think it's got to be very reassuring for everybody out there to know how carefully your embryos and eggs are handled, because people do worry about that. And they get very anxious about, where did these embryos or eggs go? And what about also the robotics? Because I know that you are groundbreaking in robotics and that technology as well.
I think I put automation in different buckets, right? There's automation in the mechanical sense, right? There's a motor doing something that a human would do. There's automation in a software sense, so that decision making, right? The system knows that there's this many spots open and this is where those spots are, and the software can assign automatically. Like, I don't need to know where it is, like the software does. So the software says, I'm going to plan to put this beacon in this spot, in this tank, right? I don't have to make that decision, the software does, right? And so then when I check it in, the software's then transmitting that data back to the EMR. The other thing is it's automatic data capture, right? We're capturing the tank vitals, for our tanks, with the temperature, the liquid nitrogen level, the stability of the environment for the tank. We're capturing, we know who did what and when. We can tie that back to that environmental record. None of these things have to be recorded. None of these things have to be written down. All of our quality control logs that we need to keep for laboratory accreditation. Why do I have to walk over and look at a thermometer and then write it down, somewhere? Like, it's not a good use of time, right? So we can use automation to do the things that automation is good at, right? Repetitive, simple tasks that are not the best use of the human's time. So we can automate a lot of the aspects. We automate the monitoring, we automate the decision making, we automate the data capture, and we automate the transcription of that. So, again, I'm an embryologist, right? I want to be doing embryology. I don't want to be sitting there recording. That's not fun, for me. And it's not really why you need someone like me in the laboratory to begin with. There's a big push to automate even more of the laboratory, and I'm very supportive of that because, at the end of the day, automation is better for certain things, right? It's, if I have to make a culture dish, right? And it's me making the dish, I'm going to have some slight variations in making the dish, right? The drop size will be pretty close to the same, depending on what tool I'm using to drip the media. I have to overlay oil onto that dish. I may have to make 50 dishes, right, at a time. I may have to make 100 dishes for the day. And so having a human do that, like, I think that's better suited for a robot, right? Because it's repeatable. It's going to be exactly the same every time. And so as we introduce these mechanized automation bits into the laboratory, it gives us an opportunity to then further analyze those operations. Meaning, if I say that, there's 5 people in my lab and everybody takes turns making dishes, there might be some slight variations in making those dishes, and if I have some metric that I'm looking in the laboratory that I may, slightly attribute to the quality of the dish making, it's going to be really hard for me to tease that out because I have variability in the dish making, right? If I had a dish making robot, then I can take that variable off the table, right? I can look at something else. So it gives me that assurance that we've removed that variable from the equation. So I do think there's a place, and I do think that, whether, certain people like it or not, it is coming, and it is, to me, not the biggest value proposition of being an embryologist is my ability to make culture dishes, right? That's it's part of it, and it was part of it for a long time. But if certain people hold their value and self-worth, and I'm speaking to embryologists, like if they hold their value and self-worth on their ability to make dishes, then you will be, replaced at some point. So I think we have to look past, I think we have to be objective, and I think we have to look past what really is the true value of the human, providing the input and doing the, doing the work and doing the decision making. But automation is coming, and I think it only serves us because it gives us a much more consistent process that we can look at and then tweak, right? Maybe we should wait 5 more seconds to do something, right? Well, how do you do that study, right? Like, I can't really do study. I can't really continue to further optimize the process if I always have this level of variability. If I can take that out, then I can start to tweak it, right? Well, we can increase the time by 10 seconds, And what does that do? And I can go back and look at my results because I've taken that variable off the table, and now it's a really consistent, data point for me. So I'm excited about it. I think it's only going to help us get better at our jobs.
Yeah, it's wonderful. That's so exciting. Imagine your beautiful future. You're snuggling with your child. You feel so connected to them. Your friends and family are so happy, and you have everything that you've ever wanted. I want this for you too, but I want more than that. I want you to feel secure knowing that you've made the best decisions, not just short term, but long term for your future family. Wherever you are on your journey, whether you're choosing a donor, choosing a clinic, learning how to talk to your donor-conceived child about their origins, all of these decisions will have wider implications for your future. And I want you to have the right resources so you can feel empowered and confident at this very important time in your life. That's why I'm so excited to introduce you to Building Your Family. It's the only expert-guided platform designed for parents and parents-to-be using reproductive medicine. We provide unique strategies that you won't find anywhere else to make your path to parenthood smoother and more informed. And that's why our approach is about offering practical and actionable steps that you can use right now. Whether you're just starting out or already deep into your process, Building Your Family is here to guide you with expert advice, specialized education, stress reduction strategies, and a community to support you every step of the way. We can't wait to see you inside. And speaking of which, one of the things that I think patients are struggling with very often is this whole idea of grading embryos because, once PGT came into play, it became, just started to snowball. People started to use it more and more. And now it's just kind of a matter of fact thing that people do. And yet we're seeing patients come back saying, hey, wait a minute, this is a pass or fail system. And I maybe have some embryos over there that could be okay. And what about them? And could I use them? And so I think that kind of begs the question, how can we automate a system where we have a better analysis of the embryos?
Yeah, there's a couple of points there, right? What you're speaking to is the evolution of our screening tools, right? So, we used to only mix egg and sperm in a dish and culture them for 2 days, and then we would transfer back to the uterus anything that, looked like it was developing, right?
Yes.
And then
I was one of those patients, by the way.
well, there you go.
Yes.
So, right? Not a lot of selection going on, right? Like whatever we get is whatever you get back. That's great, and then, ICSI was a major advancement for us because now we could actually treat male factor, right? We could treat men that had lower sperm counts than would be successful with this just mixing the eggs and sperm in a dish. That actually treated a fair amount of male factor because you could take a lower amount of sperm and concentrate it and get it right next to the egg, where if it's happening in vivo, the woman ovulates and here's the egg coming down the fallopian tube, but the sperm still have to swim all the way up. So we know not as many of them are getting up there, right? So in vitro fertilization, we can take that egg and we just put them right together, right? So you're shortening that path, to getting them in the first place. But yeah, ICSI, gave us that ability to really, bump to the next level. Well, then we started culturing out to day 5, right? Because technically the embryo on day 2 or 3 is still in the fallopian tube. It's actually not yet in the uterus. So to even put an embryo back into the uterus on day 3 is a little bit premature, right? Because it's not supposed to be there and it's nowhere near ready to implant into that uterus. So it's just there a few days ahead of time. So is that the best environment to be in? It's not bad. It works. We know that lots of people get pregnant, but technically that embryo on day 3 is still in that fallopian tube, coming down. So again, how do we optimize that environment? So then if it gets to the blastocyst stage, right, most embryos, most embryos can kind of crawl to day 3 of development. By the time you get to the blastocyst, you start to see that attrition, right? We know that not every embryo, if we have 5 embryos on day 3, I don't expect all 5 to make it, to the blastocyst stage. And that blastocyst stage can happen anywhere from day 5 all the way as late as day 7. So you're looking at visibly tools for me with my eyeballs to look and see how it is down that path of development, how much it has developed. And then I get to make an assessment of what that, what the grade is, right? At the 8-cell stage on day 3, the cells of that embryo are basically all the same. They're pretty comparable. By the time you get to that blastocyst development, you're now talking about a completely different thing, because now effectively the genome has been turned on. Cell division up to that point has been largely driven by the cytoplasm of the egg and the mitochondrial DNA, and that division is driven by that. After day 3, that sort of genome has been turned on, and now you start to see male contribution to that development. So when you get to that blastocyst stage, you actually have now, for the first time, 2 distinct cell lines. So 8 cells, they're all kind of the same. When you get to the blastocyst, now you're looking at something that has 2 distinct cell lines. The blastocyst is kind of this round ball, the cells all around the outside, and then there's like a clump of cells in the middle on one side. That clump of cells is called the inner cell mass. That's actually what forms the fetus. The cells all around the outside, that is called the trophectoderm, and that's what gives rise to the placenta. So at that very early stage, we're already able to see that there's that the cell lines can develop and differentiate, right? So it's a big milestone in development. And then, what is the quality of those cell groups, right? Is it a really poorly developed trophectoderm and only a few cells, and we think it's not, we have to make some assessment about, what the grade of that is. What's the grade of the piece, what the inner cell mass? And so we kind of make an assessment. And how big is it, right? How many cells, how many times have the cell divided? And so we can look at that. If we do genetic testing, we can take some of those trophectoderm cells. We never biopsy the inner cell mass. We take some of the trophectoderm cells and we say, okay, well, what is the status of those cells, right? Are they euploid or aneuploid? So do they have the correct number of chromosomes, or don't they? And there can be errors in this. The concordance rate, meaning the probability that the cells around the outside are exactly the same as the cells on the inside, it's not 100%, but it's pretty darn close. And so we can say with great certainty that a sample of these cells is going to be, for all intents and purposes, representative of the cells, in that inner cell mass. And so now we can say, okay, well, are there 23 pairs? Are there only 22 pairs? Is there an uneven number of chromosomes? Was there abnormal replication of the DNA? Are there 3 copies of chromosome 10? Is only 1 copy of chromosome 2? One of the things that we figured out, this was a long time ago, but, like the single biggest source of or cause of miscarriage is like trisomy 16, right? So there's 3 copies of of chromosome number 16. And we can see that when we do the testing, right? So if you see that, we can choose to not transfer that embryo and give that patient, which is effectively a futile transfer, right? Like, would that implant? Probably, at what point it's going to stop, sometime, in the next 2, 4, 8 weeks, is its most likely thing is it's going to stop developing. So we just wasted 3 months of your time transferring an embryo that was a great looking blastocyst, but had this thing wrong with it, right? The safest things to transfer, ironically, are embryos that are missing a chromosome, right? There's nobody that has a live birth that only has 1 copy of chromosome 10. That monosomies do not exist, in nature. There's an argument about Turner's where it's X naught, but that's not really, we're talking about a true monosomy. Trisomies do exist in nature, right? Most famously, trisomy 21 as presented as Down syndrome, trisomy 18, trisomy 16. We know that these are live births because we can see them,
Yes.
So, we have the opportunity to further select these embryos based on the viability of having a live birth or not. So, it's, again, a long-winded sort of, back and forth. But at the end of the day, we're looking at, how can we best not waste people's times? You're a patient coming in, like, you can tell me this and you can tell me this, but, at the end of the day, I want a baby. And like, what's the fastest way? Right? So my recommendation would be, like, do this. And, I would recommend testing your embryos because it's going to give us that little extra discretion at the end to say, well, if I've got 4 embryos, well, these 2 are aneuploid and these 2 are euploid, right? So I can at least get down to, I can take 50% of the opportunity off the table, right away, because that's not going to end well for you. So it just gives us that greater tool. With advancements in that, that testing, like we get to now discern even more clearly, right? At today, somewhere around 65% of euploid embryos that we call normal will implant. About 35% of them that won't. And, so what's different about those 35%? And so it's super exciting to me, to continue to develop and push the needle on, discerning what are the characteristics, in those subsets that we can further, like, can we get that number to 80%, right? Like, how many
Yes.
more patients can we get pregnant? How many more miscarriages can we save? How much time can we save these people from that wait to parenthood? And it's a really exciting opportunity, for me professionally. And all I can think about is, like, just continuing to make sure that we shorten that time and stop wasting people's time and money.
So one of the things that we have now, right, is that this idea of using AI to watch the embryos.
Yes. I mean, so we do have tools now that take away some of that subjectivity, right? This is historically documented where, there's 10 embryologists in the room and you give them the same embryo to look at independently. And I guarantee you that they're not going to come up with the same answer every time, right? Number one, these are living,
Humans.
these are dividing constantly. This is, we don't freeze them. You're looking at them differently. Are you looking at the same angle? Did it roll over? You're getting a better view, or even with a picture, right? We're humans. We're well-meaning, but we're fallible, and we are a slave to our subjectivity, right? So how do we bring objectivity into that, right? One way is automation. So we can train models now and say, okay, based on these thousands and thousands of embryos, and this is what they've been, graded, by the human, and this is what they've been graded by the algorithm, right? So it's objective, right? It's this many microns across. Okay. The number of trophectoderm cells is this many, right? Counted by a machine, not a human. It just gives us that reproducible way of objective analysis. So the machine can say, you know what, I'm going to give it this grade. The human can turn around and say, okay, well, I'm going to give it this grade. And, then there has to be a decision made. But the data coming out from some of these companies is pretty impressive, right? It takes that level of subjectivity out of it. So, there's a group in the UK that has been looking at this for, I don't know, over a dozen years. And they've developed their own algorithm, and they call it, so it's CARE, which is a group in the UK. And they've come up with this algorithm that's called CARE Maps. And I keep begging them to release it on the market. But they swear by it. And their rates of success are pretty impressive using it. And so every single one of their clinics uses this algorithm. They use time-lapse incubators, and they use this algorithm to put an objective grade on those embryos. And it really helps their system and network because they don't have that, fluctuating. They've taken that element off the table, right? So now they can focus on other things. There's a bunch of companies in the space. There's a bunch of startups that they're looking at different kinds of automation, but a lot of them are looking at our embryos and embryo grading, right? Because we know that we think differently, right? It's published. It's not, it's just a fact, right? You're going to get 10 super experienced embryologists, and I won't say they all come up with something different, but you are not going to get all 10 of them to agree on that grade. And again, it keeps bumping us up on our accountability, on our ability to do a consistently good job. And I think it's great. I'm fully supportive of bringing these technologies. Again, like, all we want to do is try to get the patients out the door, right?
Yeah. Pregnant.
Yes. Go tell your friends, right? I don't want to keep doing cycles for you. Like, I want to see you once and I want you to be done. So that's the goal. That should be the goal. Just get them in and get them out. And I don't need to be doing 2 and 3 and 4 cycles on a patient. I mean, of course you do, but not if I don't have to, if I have really good tools, because, like I was saying before, maybe there's not a baby in that cohort, right? That shouldn't be surprising, to people. And, we know what the odds are. We know what the probability is. But maybe we can get to that decision. You know what? There's no baby in this cohort. Go to the next one, right? Let's get a new batch of eggs. Let's do something else. Like, let's just keep keep moving down that, how do we get you out of here, with a baby.
That's great. That's great. And how long do you think it will be until the average patient can see this sort of technology come into their clinic?
So I would say it's in some clinics now, right? There's different levels of automation in different clinics, right? So some are using this embryo grading algorithm. There are some other companies working on optimizing the ovarian stimulation protocols and programs
Oh,
so that we can try to, maybe maximize the number of eggs that we can get. Again, these are decisions, that are made by humans. So, okay, well, we've monitored you, and on the 9th day of your stimulation, this is the size of your follicles, and this is your progesterone, and this is your estradiol, and we're looking at certain things, and we're making a decision, right? Do you need 1 more day? Do you need 2 more days? And so there are some groups now that have either developed or are developing different algorithms to input those numbers into the system and say, okay, well, you know what? Based on our historical data that's in our program, you should give that patient 2 more days of meds, right? We're able to see the fruits of our labor, right? Like we can collect all this data, but if we don't do something with it, then we're doing a disservice, not only to ourselves, but to the patients. So
yes.
there's a group, in the U.S. Fertility, right? And they've got, they've been really, really strong at data collection, and they're now as a network analyzing all of their data and trying to bring that to all of the groups and saying, okay, well, based on the data, it's evidence-based decision making. Like we have the evidence, we have the data to back it up, and it's not necessarily because this is how I always do it, or I feel this way or I feel differently. I mean, obviously, we need to be super careful about the data going into the model. We have to query the models. We have to make sure that they're making sense. We have to make sure that the output is good. And, there's a ton of work to be done to continue to refine this and make sure that the data is good and it's safe and it's a producible outcome. But, moving in that direction and bringing those, really smart bioinformatics people and IT people and bringing in these machine learning experts and working on all these algorithms is only going to make us do our job better. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's great news, and it's great news for everybody to know about because nobody really knows what's happening behind the scenes, and I think it's very reassuring. The other question I wanted to ask you, Cynthia, was about PGTM. Maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about that because I know you feel like that's being underutilized now.
So, we talked a bit about the aneuploidy, right? Whether or not that embryo had the correct number of chromosomes. But the other thing that you can do with this pre-implantation genetic testing is look for certain monogenic disease states. So you can say, to a patient that, they say they carry the cystic fibrosis gene. And it's a mutation. There are certain mutations that people carry, and some of them may be passed down to their children, and some of them may not. And it depends then on who you married and then what their genetic profile is. So I think we've come to a point, it's 2025, where the majority of women, I don't have this data actually, but it seems like most women are doing carrier screening, in a workup and a lead up to future family building. Right? Someone has
Yes.
heard this carrier screen that says, okay, well, we've looked at this few hundred genes and, they're all perfectly normal, right? Or maybe there's a mutation here or a mutation here. Well, then depending on your chosen future, intended parent, sperm provider, then, that person should be tested to make sure that they don't have anything that might, sort of line up, because then depending on the probability, whether or not you might pass that down to the child. And maybe it's completely benign, but maybe it's not, right? There's,
Yes.
we see, I mean, think of sickle cell, right? We've
Yes.
come up with like billion-dollar, I'm exaggerating, but like billion-dollar treatments, to try to cure or treat sickle cell. Well, what if we could just prevent it in the first place?
Yes.
To borrow a Dr. David Sable, 3 things that we should worry about. It's time to baby, dollars to baby, and life disruption to baby. And how do we get more people, in the door by tackling some of these things? But the other thing that we can tackle is this notion of, IVF for disease prevention. So if we can deploy this technology, and now instead of that couple trying to figure out if they should even have kids because they know the kid is going to be affected, with horrible or potentially fatal genetic disease, we can eliminate it, right? So from just a group health perspective, the cost of treatment over the lifetime for someone with, given the two examples, very common, like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell, millions and millions and millions of dollars, right? If you did one cycle of PGT with this, genetic testing, and we screened for that mutation and we did not transfer an embryo that carried that mutation, you've just saved that health insurance company millions and millions and millions of dollars, right? So, as a public health issue, I think it's, the actuaries are going to figure out at some point that this actually probably makes sense mathematically for them to pay for this proactively rather than reactively. But since we're doing a lot more screening, since we are seeing this, and it is just a guaranteed, cure, if you will, for preventing that disease, I think that it's a real opportunity for bringing this in vitro fertilization technology to that piece of the population, right? Like we can widen the door and allow now this group in because we're able to test that, right? They may not be infertile, right? But patients that are freezing their eggs are not infertile either, right? We keep opening the door wider to improve access to care. So let's open the door wider and invite all of these people in so that we can do this IVF for disease prevention, and then save them, future heartache and pain and suffering.
Yes.
And I think that, there's a number of, genetic testing companies out there. Not all of them offer this testing. It's one of the things that I'm really focusing on, with this new company that I've started. I do think there's an opportunity there. And I think that message that, hey, come to this, this basically solves your problems, right? All of your heartache, all of your pain, all of your suffering, all of your worry about potentially passing this on to your progeny, we can take that off the table for you, and we have this, and it's accessible and it's easy, and we've made it so that there's a clear path, from A to B. And again, depending on the patient, they're not coming in with a diagnosis of infertility. So, it was like the original patients, like you love to see a patient that has blocked tubes, right? They're infertile, but they're not infertile because the egg sperm interactions were failing, right?
Yes.
They're infertile because there's a mechanical blockage, right? Like
yes.
Plumbing. It's a plumbing problem.
Right.
So you see that diagnosis and you're like, like I've got to
I could take care of that.
Yeah, like that's easy. I can fix that, right? Like completely circumvented the blockage. Well, we can fix this family building for them. I can completely circumvent that mutated gene, right? And I just think it gives, again, I'm always on the, I'm always going to come down on the patient side, and I'm always going to come down on the improving access to care side. And this was an interesting opportunity that came up for me that allows me to now kind of solve that problem from this angle. And so super excited.
It's amazing. So in an ideal world, how would that work? Would someone go to their annual physical and their physician says, let's take this, group of tests and see if you're a carrier for something, somebody who's not necessarily an IVF patient?
Yeah, it could be done at the GP level. It could be, their obstetrician, their GYN. That, hopefully people have been monitored by a GYN at least post puberty, that they get regular pap smears and they get a workup, and then there's a conversation about future family building, and and this is part of that process, right? Well, okay, if you've never thinking about family building, then maybe there's no reason to ever do it. So, it's an ongoing conversation, within the healthcare system that ideally is happening much further upstream. Oftentimes it's not happening until you see them at the first infertility appointment, and they've never had this workup. They've never had an AMH done. They've never had, an ultrasound of their ovaries. They've never had an ultrasound of their uterus. They've never had, a carrier screen test. Like they're coming in blind. And that's fine. But in an ideal, sort of utopian world, these things are being addressed, as that person travels through their life. They're 26 years old and they have a serious boyfriend, and maybe they're thinking of having kids, and that's a conversation with your GYN. And okay, so maybe I need to talk about birth control. Maybe I need to talk about sexually transmitted disease, and I need to talk about, carrier screening. And, it starts that conversation, whenever it gets started. As long as it starts, it's great. But I think there's a benefit to knowing that ahead of time, right?
Yes.
I have beta thalassemia, right? I've known that since I was a child. I'm anemic. When I met my now husband, I didn't get tested right away, but that was one of the things that it was very unlikely that he was going to have it. But we did send him for carrier screening as we were thinking about, starting our family, because I knew it. I mean, I knew it because I'm symptomatic and, I've known it, basically my whole life. But if I didn't know that I carried something, you wouldn't know it until you test it, right? You don't want to find out in the NICU,
Yes.
that there was something and that you passed it on and you didn't know about. So
Yes.
I think it gives us a really interesting opportunity to prevent that downstream pain and suffering.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so fascinated by this also because my children, I don't have a lot of their genetics because they were all adopted. And my youngest son, when he did the 23andMe, found out he's a cystic fibrosis carrier. So this is another example where you just wouldn't know, right? You just wouldn't have any idea. And so, as you're saying, all of this, it's making so much sense that people should not just be thinking about getting pregnant, but about their overall health and about the child's future health, and to think about these things way ahead of time. So you're set up for success when you decide it's time.
Yeah, that's it. It's simple.
It's great.
Piece of cake.
It's amazing. Well, not a piece of cake.
Well,
Maybe a piece of cake for you, Cynthia, but not for most of us. But it's incredible the work you're doing. And I'm so glad that you came here today. As we wind down, is there a place where people can reach out to you or look at some of your companies? Could you share the websites or information?
So if people want to check out Tomorrow Life Science, you can go to www.tmrw.org. If you want to look at more things about genetic testing, you can go to www.novagenomics.org. And if you're looking for a clinic and you're local to the New York City area, I now have one in northern New Jersey, and you can go to www.perchfertility.com, and we'd be happy to help you on your family building journey. And if anyone reach out to me, I can give you my email address, and Cynthia Hudson at mac.com, mac.com. Anybody can reach out. I'm always happy to
so nice.
Talk to patients and answer their questions. I think we have to, right? If people can't get their questions answered, then we've failed as an industry, to help them down that road. If they're stuck because they don't know, then it's just a terrible place to be in a position where you can't get answers to questions. So I'll make myself available for that.
Well, I'm so grateful for that because there's so much misinformation out there. We see that every day on social media. And so I'm so grateful to you for coming on this podcast and sharing it with the public. And I really hope that we'll be able to do this again as things move along in all of these great advanced technologies.
Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, great conversation. I think it's a really good opportunity to try to share what's out there and what we know to be true and what we know not to be true, and kind of keep stomping down the non-facts from the actual facts, and just keep pushing the needle. And
so important.
Yeah, that's great. No, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you out there. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. It's so important to arm yourself with the right information. So I'm glad that you came, and I hope you join me next week. Thank you for joining me today. I hope this was helpful to you. And if you'd like more personalized support, more information, and more education, you can find it in the show notes under the Building Your Family community. We'd love to see you inside. And if you were interested in today's topic, you will really like this video.